Why did the most expensive artist of the 19th century spend his whole life painting the same mountain? Why did people who first mocked him later call him the god of painting? And how did a provincial neurotic become the father of all modern art? Hello everyone, this is Ninashev, and today I'm going to tell you the amazing story of Paul Cézanne. A provincial man who was afraid of his father, hid his wife and son from him for more than 10 years, was terrified of physical contact, and at the same time revolutionized painting that would be called the most important in the last 200 years. Paul Cézanne was born on January 19, 1839 in Aix-en-Provence, a small picturesque town in the south of France, surrounded by greenery and apple trees, from any point of which you could see the looming mass of Mount Sainte-Victoire. This bourgeois, prosperous little town seemed to have frozen 50 years ago and stubbornly refused to change. It resisted progress, even banning the railroad so it wouldn't disturb the peace of the self-absorbed bourgeois who lived there. Paul's father, Louis-Auguste Cézanne, was an unconventional man by local standards. He came from Italy and started from scratch in a hat shop. Then he started his own business and began lending money to farmers at interest so they could raise rabbits for felt. And soon he saw the bankruptcy of the only bank in town as an opportunity and became co-owner of the Cézanne and Cabasso Bank. By the time his son was born, he was already the richest man in town, and in 1853 he bought the luxurious Jas de Bouffon estate, the former residence of the governor of Provence and the future home of Cézanne. However, the high society of Aix never accepted him. He was considered an uncouth nouveau riche who had barged into respectable society. He had enough money, but his origins let him down. The aristocrats of Aix accepted his money, but looked down on him, envying him while still holding him in contempt. And Louis-Auguste dreamed of only one thing, that his son would become a successful lawyer and take revenge for all the humiliations by entering the doors that had always remained closed to Louis-Auguste himself. This passion of his father would leave a powerful mark on Cézanne's fate. Paul grew up as a shy, awkward boy, extremely sensitive and strong-willed. He had haptophobia, a panic fear of being touched. Later, when working with models, Paul did his best to avoid accidental contact. Once a fellow artist simply patted him on the back as a sign of admiration, and Cézanne silently gathered his things and went home. He never spoke to that person again. And another time, when a model accidentally touched him during a posing session, he yelled at him so much that the model ran away and never came back. Here in Aix, when he was still a child, he had the most important encounter of his life. In 1852, at the age of 13, Paul entered the Bourbon College in Aix. There he met a skinny, sickly boy who spoke with a Parisian accent and had a speech defect that amused everyone. Instead of S and Z, he pronounced T, and when he spoke, he sprayed a lot of saliva. He was constantly picked on, an outsider, small, frail, and poor. His name was Émile Zola, the future greatest novelist of France, who, because of his lisp, called Cézanne Titan. Zola's father died when Émile was only 7 years old. The family barely made ends meet. Cézanne took Zola's side after some school scuffle when he was once again bullied. He was the only one who dared to talk to the outcast. The next day, Zola brought him a huge basket of apples and said, "Look at these apples, Titan. They've come from far away." These apples would later become surrounded by endless myths, just like this entire friendship and its sad ending, which perhaps caused the artist the deepest wound of his life. They climbed mountains together, went hunting, fell in love, and dreamed together. Both of them were convinced that they would become famous poets. Glory, wealth, the love of women, and Paris at their feet. And both of them would achieve their fame, but not at all in the way they expected. In the summer of 1858, thunder struck. Zola's grandmother, who managed the entire household, passed away, and Zola's mother was forced to go to Paris in search of help from relatives, and soon she called her son to Paris as well. And the two inseparable friends had to part ways. Cézanne fell into depression. His friend was already in Paris, taking the first step toward his dream while he was still in Provence. Childhood paradise was over, real life had begun, sometimes doubly so. By the age of 18, Paul decided to become an artist. He was already attending the municipal drawing school at the City Museum of Aix, which was run by Joseph Djeba, the museum's curator, and a staunch supporter of academicism. Cézanne's father agreed to this whim because, in principle, artistic knowledge was quite suitable for polishing his future brilliant instrument of revenge. The museum displayed a decent collection of paintings by Granit, several canvases by old masters, and a tiny window onto the wider world, which was the only way for young Cézanne to see real art. Zola from across France bombarded Paul with letters. He had already made it to Paris, languishing in poverty in a tiny room where every sound from the neighboring cheap brothel could be heard through the thin walls, and yet he enthusiastically described to his friend how he could live nearby. From 6 to 11, you'll be painting from life in the studio, then lunch, and from noon to 4, you'll be making a copy of a masterpiece you like at the Louvre. I even calculated it. 125 francs a month will be enough for you for everything. But Paul's father, as you probably already know, like all artists with well-off parents, was categorically against it. He was raising himself a successor and revenge against all the high society of Aix, not just some artist. Louis Auguste looked at his son's desire to become an artist with undisguised horror. He sat Paul down with law books and declared his son would become a lawyer. Thus began Cézanne's double life, which would drag on for what felt like forever. On one side, Paris, the restless Zola, and a passion for painting. On the other, Provence, a strict father, and dependence on his money. And between these two fires, Cézanne would be torn until both of them burned out. Paul, a man who would later challenge the Paris Salon itself, was very afraid of his strict father, so with a heavy heart, he sat down to study. For 3 years, he studied law at the University of Aix and at the same time continued attending art school. In his law notes from that period, drawings have been preserved in the margins. On a page of the bank ledger, where his father sometimes made him work, he wrote, "Cézanne the banker looks on in despair as his son becomes an artist in the office." Cézanne's father still loved his son, so he tried to resolve the issue diplomatically. He went to Gibert at the drawing school and asked directly if his son had any talent. Gibert, who didn't want to lose a good student, replied that it was more likely no than yes. He came home triumphant. "See, the expert said so. What makes you think you're going to Paris? Forget Paris." And Cézanne, already lacking confidence in himself, lost all hope after such a verdict from his first teacher. He convinced himself that he was worthless, and this conviction, this trauma, would haunt him for the rest of his life. But his passion for painting eventually prevailed, and he started painting again like a madman. And after 3 years, seeing how his son was failing at office work and how he was obsessed with painting, his father gave in. He gave Paul 150 francs a month, just enough not to starve, and personally accompanied his son to Paris, although he was sure and secretly hoped for his future failure. The 22-year-old Paul Cézanne saw Paris for the first time. At that time, Paris was undergoing reconstruction. The grand plan for renovating the center of the French capital, the so-called Haussmannisation, and turning it into the most beautiful city in the world, was in full swing. It was the largest urban development project in the history of Europe. Old houses and slums in the center were being demolished, wide avenues were being laid out, with luxurious mansions springing up on either side, and the restaurants and cafes were packed with the bourgeoisie throwing money around. Paris was acquiring the polish and glamour of the cultural capital of the world, and the provincial, with his rough manners, was simply crushed by Paris. Zola greeted his friend with open arms. The first thing they did was go to a little restaurant to celebrate their meeting, and Cézanne immediately flew into a rage. There was no olive oil on the table. "Welcome to Paris, you provincial." Cézanne applied to the country's main art school, the School of Fine Arts, and was rejected. The examiners delivered their verdict. He has the temperament of a colorist, but he tends toward extremes. He wasn't even allowed to participate in the competition. This greatly hurt Cézanne's confidence and led him to despair. Zola first supported his friend by inviting him to cafes and introducing him to key people. But Cézanne was gloomy, avoided socializing, and constantly insisted that nothing was working out for him, that maybe he belonged at home in Aix, and that Paris was not for him. Zola even commissioned his own portrait from his friend to cheer him up. But Cézanne couldn't manage it, and he simply tore it up, sinking even deeper into depression. In the end, after 5 months, Cézanne packed his things and went home, to the lovely provincial Aix and his predictable family. Louis Auguste welcomed his son with a triumphant look and immediately got him a job as a clerk in his bank. Every morning, he would come to the dusty office, write down numbers, and look out the window. After a while, he realized that he had given up too quickly. He would secretly draw in the evenings, leave work unexpectedly, and take long walks. And soon he started drawing again. In the end, His father realized that his son couldn't be stopped and reluctantly agreed to let him try again. But only on one condition, that his son would follow an academic path, get an art education, and become a real artist, not just all this other stuff. So, a year later, Cézanne goes to Paris again and makes a second attempt to enter the Academy of Fine Arts, and once again, he fails. But this time he didn't go home. He lied to his father, saying he got in so he could stay in Paris and keep his allowance. That's how Cézanne's double life began. He enrolled in the Académie Suisse, an open studio run by a former model, where you could draw from life for a modest fee. It was a huge, smoky, dirty hall on the Ile de la Cité. It was there that Courbet and Delacroix used to work. There, Cézanne first met Camille Pissarro, who would later become the most important person in his artistic life. For now, Cézanne was feeling down. He looked at the works of other students, young, confident Parisians, and felt like a country bumpkin. His painting was dark, rough, almost furious. He applied paint with a palette knife in thick layers, so much so that one critic would later write, "His paint seemed as if it could be fired from a pistol." In the Louvre, he would stand for hours in front of Rubens, Titian, Velázquez, and on the one hand, he couldn't understand how they did it, but on the other, stubborn as a ram, he started to think that if the academics rejected him, he would go his own way. He would not follow their lead. After all, as long as his father thinks he's making progress, he won't starve. Это карусель, Париж. This cycle of failure and travel between Aix and Paris, known as Cézanne's pendulum, will repeat itself over and over again. In Paris, he felt like a stranger, but as soon as he left, he felt he had betrayed his dream and would return again. In 1863, an event occurred that changed Cézanne's ideas about what was even possible in painting. That year, the official Salon jury rejected more than 3,000 works. The artists were outraged, and the scandal reached Napoleon III himself. He reviewed the rejected works and decreed, "Let the public decide for themselves." Thus, the exhibition of the rejected was opened, an alternative salon in the neighboring halls of the Palace of Industry for those who had been refused. I talk about this in detail in my video about Impressionism. Be sure to watch it. I'll leave the link in the description. It's the best video about Impressionism, I promise you. A huge crowd came, mostly to mock. People laughed, whistled, and made jokes. They brought ladies to admire the risque art. On the very first day, there were 7,000 visitors. That's more than attended the official salon. The main target of ridicule was Edouard Monet's painting, Luncheon on the Grass. Two dressed men and next to them a naked woman looking straight at the viewer without any embarrassment. It was painted with flat, pure colors without any academic shading. The public was furious. The critics were outraged. Napoleon III called the painting obscene. Also see my video about Edouard Monet. It's interesting. The link is in the description. Обязательно посмотрите после этого видео. Cézanne visited the Salon of the Refused, saw Monet's painting and thought, this is it. It's not the subject or nudity, but the style. Monet painted the way he saw, not the way the rules prescribed. He broke all the canons, and that was not a mistake. Cézanne seemed to see living proof that critics' rejection isn't decisive. The truth is the ultimate authority, that they can be completely ignored and you can keep following your own path. Right in front of him is another misunderstood and even despised artist, but he keeps creating and produces something beautiful. So, is it really possible? Besides, they had something else in common. Neither of them had to make a living from painting, unlike Claude Monet and Renoir. То есть они вполне могли рисковать. They met Monet in person at the Café Gerbois, a favorite meeting place for the Parisian avant-garde on the Grande Rue. Monet, Degas, Pissarro, Renoir, Sisley and Basile used to gather there. A whole generation, who at that time were still a group of rebellious artists calling themselves the Intransigents, and who would soon be called the Impressionists. Zola also went there. The atmosphere was lively and passionate, and the arguments were loud. Cézanne, together with Zola, would also become one of the initiators of the young artists' rebellion against the Salon. But Cézanne fit into this company in his own unique way. He would show up, go around to everyone present and shake their hands. But when he got to Monet, polished, elegant, perfumed, with a beard curled by tongs, he would stop and, deliberately exaggerating his Provençal accent, say, "To you, Monsieur Monet, I will not offer my hand since I haven't washed for a week." Then he would sit in a corner away from everyone, stay silent, occasionally make rude remarks, and leave, muttering something under his breath. Monet endured his antics with surprise and a certain understanding, while the others watched with curiosity. Claude Monet later recalled that Cézanne, as soon as he crossed the threshold, would hitch up his trousers with a characteristic movement of his hips, throw open his jacket, walk around everyone, and when meeting Monet, would take off his hat with particular ostentation. This whole ritual caused both laughter and bewilderment at the same time. It was a kind of defensive reaction, a projection of his inner fear of high society, instilled in him by his father, who himself never gained access to it. A provincial among Parisians, a man without an academic education among recognized artists, his roughness was a shield, hiding the very insecurity that would never leave him throughout his life, and that showed itself in his gloomy, somewhat coarse character. In general, he was unbearable, more unsociable than sociable, and therefore, for the most part, lonely. The Paris Salon, essentially an annual painting exhibition and fair, was at that time the highest authority for an artist and the only place in the world where one could gain recognition and start a career. All young artists, including the Impressionists, dreamed of getting into it. Only the Salon at that time opened the way to wealthy patrons, but the Salon could not tolerate anything new. No experiments with painting, no liberties, everything had to strictly follow the canons of classicism, battle or mythological scenes, portraits, or at the very least landscapes. But landscapes and still lifes were considered the least significant category of painting. And the Salon jury, with rare consistency, rejected Cézanne's works year after year from 1864 to 1882 every time. The critics who happened to see his works didn't hold back. Madman, barbarian, house painter. One wrote that Cézanne was clearly suffering from delirium tremens. Another person suggested his works were painted with a rag instead of a brush. The caricaturist Stock published parodies of his paintings in the newspaper. Cézanne responded publicly, и это единственный раз, когда он дал публичный... Yes, dear Mr. Stock, I paint my pictures as I see, as I feel. Everyone else also feels and sees as I do, but they don't dare. I do dare. He who laughs last laughs best. In 1866, he and Zola led a rebellion of young artists against the official Salon. Zola had a phenomenal career, and by the age of 25 was working at Paris's most popular newspaper, L'Événement. And for this, he received a huge salary of 500 francs a month. The newspaper owner thought any scandal boosted sales and constantly sought sensational stories. The official Salon was absolutely ruthless. Year after year, it rejected the works of young and bold artists. The jury would reject paintings just by seeing the name of an artist who was on their blacklist. It got to the point where paintings signed with the artist's real name were rejected, but the very same paintings signed with a pseudonym were later approved. Zola conducted an investigation and wrote an article in which he lashed out at the old men stuck in the past century who dismember art and put its mutilated corpse on display. This article caused a real scandal in Paris. Zola wrote another one in which he praised the artists of the new art. And he dedicated the third article to praising Edouard Monet, who had exhibited his scandalous Olympia at the Salon a year earlier. That was already too much, defending this hack Monet. The Parisian public was outraged, threatened to cancel their newspaper subscriptions, and Zola had to back down, but the main thing had already been done. For the first time, a powerful voice was raised in defense of the new art. And from that moment on, a very slow but relentless erosion of the old system would begin, which would soon be swept away by Impressionism. Cézanne, however, was never mentioned by Zola in his articles. Art historians wonder why this happened, why Zola, the most passionate defender of innovators, remained silent about his friend, whose talent was becoming more and more obvious. Maybe he was afraid of being accused of favoritism, or maybe because of the awkwardness, since he took Gabrielle Maille, the woman Cézanne was in love with, right from under his nose, and for whom Cézanne even shaved off all his facial hair. But I tend to think it was more about rivalry. Having already achieved fame, lively, energetic, and popular Zola looked down on his childhood friend, who was insecure, shy, and untidy. This often happens to people who have escaped poverty. The successes of those closest to them hurt them the most. At the beginning of 1869, Cézanne met 19-year-old Hortense Fiquet at the Académie Suisse. She was an artist's model, earning her living by posing for painters. She was a blonde, large-framed, calm patient, and able to sit motionless for hours. For Cézanne, whose models would fall asleep or run away after half an hour, this was almost perfect. They lived together, and in January 1872 they had a son, also named Paul. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War began, and to avoid being drafted, Cézanne hid in L'Estaque, a small fishing town near Marseille. This is how Cézanne found his third place of inspiration, L'Estaque. His constant wanderings between Aix and Paris turned into a triangle. While critics trampled on Cézanne and the public laughed, there was one person who was unconditionally on his side. That was Camille Pissarro, one of the 7 future great Impressionists. Pissarro was 9 years older than Cézanne, wise, kind, patient, one of those rare people whose presence can soften even the most explosive and negative character. He was the first to sense something special in Cézanne's work. I saw him at work. His painting is remarkable for its strength and power. If he stays here for a while, he will surprise many artists who were quick to judge him. Cézanne moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, where Pissarro lived and where 20 years later, under strange circumstances, Van Gogh would die. You can learn more about this in my video about Van Gogh. They worked side by side for several years. This was the most important, I would even say formative or defining, artistic education in Cézanne's life. Not the academy, not the jury, but a specific person nearby who patiently explained, this is how you should observe nature, this is how you work outdoors, this is how you build space through light, through line. Cézanne's palette began to lighten under Pissarro's influence. The dark, gloomy tones of his early works began to fade away. Light appeared, the very Provençal light that was almost absent from his earlier paintings and which would soon make him famous. The black paints disappeared, replaced by pure colors, and objects were now separated from each other, not by black contrasting shadows, but by the selection of contrasting colors. Pissarro did not try to turn Cézanne into... He wanted to be, he was always searching for his own path. Moreover, he was terrified of any influence, believing it could distort his own vision, his style. He believed that an artist should be able to perceive the world around him as it is, without adding anything of his own, and that only such pure perception and conveying that view of the world onto the canvas is true art. And Pissarro helped this sullen and explosive man find himself to get rid of his imposter syndrome. Painting has power. We need to make Impressionism into something solid, like the art in museums, said Cézanne, trying to find something greater than Impressionism. They worked side by side in the open air, setting up their easels just a few meters apart, painting the same landscape. Then Cézanne would return home angry, destroy what he had painted, and start again. Pissarro saw this, but still supported and continued to teach him, until finally, by the end of the 1870s, after hundreds of experiments, Cézanne found what would make him the father of modern art. Near the end of his life, Cézanne referred to himself as Pissarro's student, even though he had already surpassed him in influence. Pissarro died in 1903, 3 years before Cézanne. Upon receiving this news, Cézanne wrote to his son, "Your father was like a father to me. He was someone you could turn to for advice, almost like the Lord God." In 1874, the future Impressionists decided to organize their own exhibition. It was the first Impressionist exhibition, a kind of artistic rebellion by experimental artists who were still restricted from entering the Paris Salon. And Cézanne also exhibited there along with Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Degas and others. This exhibition opened in the studio of the photographer Nadar on the Boulevard des Capucines. It was there that the critic Leroy, who wrote a scathing column, accidentally coined the word Impressionism, from the title of Monet's painting Impression, Sunrise. Though it was meant as a mockery, it stuck. It was Cézanne's works that provoked the most intense rejection at this exhibition. Among other things, he exhibited his own modern Olympia there as an homage and an extreme version of Edouard Manet's Olympia, showing the world just how far one could go in painting. It features the same nude woman, the same maid, and he even added a client to the painting to further intensify the scandalous effect. As a result, according to viewers and critics, the painting turned out to be completely absurd, both technically sloppy and scandalous in its subject matter. Louis Leroy wrote that upon seeing the painting, the public went into a frenzy. People laughed and couldn't calm down. A critic said you could lose your mind before this painting. And now remember how sensitive and vulnerable Cézanne was. Can you imagine how he felt under a barrage of ridicule and sarcastic comments? He reacted the same way he always did, by running away. He no longer wrote response manifestos, didn't cause any more scandals, just left for X again, and resignedly and stubbornly kept painting. Meanwhile, fellow artists respected and collected his works. Pissarro believed in him unconditionally. Claude Monet, the future god of Impressionism, be sure to watch the video about him on my channel, collected his works. Renoir called him the greatest among us. Gauguin valued one of Cézanne's paintings so much that he refused to sell it even in his leanest times. But the public, critics, the salon, none of them acknowledged him. I would even say they despised him. And his beloved childhood friends simply stayed silent. Can you imagine the pressure that put on Cézanne? So many years of misunderstanding from all sides, and on top of that, a very successful childhood friend who moved far ahead right before the artist's eyes, fulfilling the dream they once shared together. And on top of that, a double life, constantly having to deceive his father so he wouldn't lose his allowance. Because that was the only way he could keep painting, since his own works weren't selling. All this burden was made even heavier by his decision to hide his new relationship with a woman and the birth of his son from his father. He was afraid that his father wouldn't approve of a model as his wife. Cézanne hid his relationship from his father for nearly 10 years, as shown in surviving letters where he avoids the subject. The nearly 40-year-old artist was terrified that his father would reduce his allowance. The situation was absurd. To avoid being seen together, Cézanne had to create complex plans while he and Hortense lived in different cities, sometimes Aix, sometimes Paris, sometimes Auvers. When he went to Aix, Hortense stayed in Paris. When he was in Paris, he carefully avoided situations where people from his ex-circle might see her. But the letters that Hortense or some Parisian friends sent him in Aix risked falling into Cézanne's father's hands. He had a habit of opening his son's letters. And to jump ahead a bit, I'll say that in 1878, that's exactly what happened. His father intercepted a letter from Victor Choquet. In the letter, Choquet carelessly mentioned Madame Cézanne and little Paul. His father was shocked and demanded an explanation. In response, Cézanne showed almost inhuman cunning and told a story that it was just some crazy woman stalking him and trying to ruin his reputation. He claimed that she was the one spreading rumors, which Choquet believed. But his father still didn't believe him and reduced his son's allowance to 100 francs. Since you're single, that should be enough for you. Little Paul Jr. grew up aware of his grandfather, though his grandfather never knew he existed. Hortensia lived as a secret mistress in cheap rented rooms, while Paul pretended to be a model son at the wealthy estate. Hortensia neither understood nor cared about painting, and preferred Paris to the provincial backwater. At the same time, she posed for him 30 times. Those were very long and very silent sessions. She complained to acquaintances that posing for Cézanne was the most boring thing in the world. He could just look at her for hours without making a single brushstroke, but the apples in his still lifes are always so fresh. He never eats them while he's working. Oh, those apples. And here we come to the most important point, the moment when Cézanne had already gained enough confidence and experience to begin developing his own style and even a philosophy of painting. Academicism, as I mentioned, required one viewpoint. The artist selected a composition and painted the whole canvas from that angle. Logical, truthful, just like in real life. Cézanne started doing things differently, and his apples became the main training ground. He set out to find the pattern, the very essence, the structure of nature, so that by seeing it, he could convey the true, living sensation of nature. He painted dozens of still lifes with apples, and art historians still argue about why he chose these particular fruits. There is a myth that apples were his sentimental response to childhood memories. Remember when Zola brought him apples after a fight, and that's how their friendship began. But this, as usual, is just romantic fiction. In reality, the place itself simply produced these apples. They were everywhere. It was nearly impossible not to paint them or include them in still lifes. And still lifes have always served artists as a kind of testing ground where they honed their skills, depicting objects, playing with light and shadow. And for this, similar objects are best suited, just like Claude Monet experimented with the Rouen Cathedral, haystacks, and poplars. By comparing, by placing side-by-side paintings of similar and even identical objects, you can understand which technique turned out better. Apples are perfect for this. On one hand, they all have a spherical shape, but on the other hand, no two apples are exactly the same. That's why you could experiment almost endlessly, searching for the perfect balance between brushstroke length, color intensity, and depth of shadows. At the same time, you don't have to worry about the mountain disappearing behind clouds or a human model getting tired. Cézanne painted very slowly and thoughtfully. Where an impressionist could create a finished painting in a single plein air session, Cézanne could return to the same motif for weeks or even months. Once he worked on a still life with apples for 115 sessions. No fruit except apples, let alone a person, could withstand such torture. Even the apples began to rot, and in the end Cézanne had to replace them with wax replicas. Thus, Cézanne's famous apples were his testing ground, the silent victims of his inhuman experiments in search of the perfect technique, which the world would soon see embodied in another of his favorite subjects. He experiments with the surroundings. His chairs and tables sometimes look overturned, tilted too far toward the viewer, in a way that any apples would have rolled off them. He alters the perspective in order to show us the apples from an angle that would not actually be visible from that position. This technique later became the basis of Fauvism, and it's no surprise Matisse called him its father. However, the critics of his time saw this as technical incompetence. They said he couldn't draw, that he painted incorrectly. That's what they said. But Cézanne no longer cared about critics and had nothing to prove to anyone. He didn't need to sell his paintings. His father gave him enough money for a modest life, and he himself was unpretentious. That's why Cézanne had long since stopped submitting his paintings to the Salon. Fearing ridicule, he withdrew into himself. He immersed himself completely in his art, in the quiet of the provinces, far from the noisy and boisterous Paris, where even the most desperate impressionists tried in vain to reach their audience. How could he, a countryman, with his view of painting understood by only one person in the world, hope to succeed? Cézanne, unlike the Impressionists who were fascinated by the play of light, the breaking up of brushstrokes and reflections, wanted to find something solid and eternal in nature. To see the hidden meaning of beauty, to uncover the structure, to absorb it and be able to convey it with paint. That's why he worked so slowly. He didn't just copy what he saw, he first tried to understand what he saw. The models would fall asleep right during the work. One of them, an elderly gardener named Vollier, said that during the entire long period of working on his portrait, Cézanne spoke no more than 20 words. He would just look, think, make a few brush strokes, and then look again. One day, Pissarro came to visit him. There was an apple lying on the table, and Cézanne asked him not to touch it. He had been working on it for 3 months already. But the apple was hardly in danger of being eaten. It was made of wax. Eyes alone aren't enough, you have to think, Cézanne. Do you see how different his approach was from Impressionism? It was even the opposite of Impressionism, whose main approach was to quickly sketch the fleeting state of nature, the impression it made. He was different from all the artists of his time. What did Cézanne and his family live on? I always address this question because it is usually the key limiting factor for any artist. The romantic myth that an artist must be poor in order to create is just another sentimental invention that contradicts everything we know about artists. In order to create, an artist must first and foremost be free, including freedom from worrying if his paintings will sell. 150 francs for the 3 of them, of course, was not enough. His paintings sold poorly, and Cézanne's entire studio was filled with experimental canvases in various stages of completion. But Cézanne met Père Tanguy, a friend of the Impressionists, who owned a shop with painting supplies. Père Tanguy often exchanged young artists' paintings for supplies, supporting them in this way, and soon this help would make him one of the first and most successful art dealers. And in 1875, Cézanne also attracted the attention of the collector Choquet, the very one who almost gave him away in a letter about his wife a bit later. And his commissions would greatly support the artist. It was his portrait that he, having skipped the second Impressionist exhibition, would submit to the third one in 1877, and it was this portrait that would provoke the most furious wave of criticism against him. The critic Louis Leroy said about the portrait of Choquet, "This is a head that looks so strange, the color of an old boot. It would shock a pregnant woman and cause yellow fever in the fetus before it was even born." What do you think Cézanne did in response? That's right, he ran away to the provinces. He never exhibited with the Impressionists again. After his father cut his allowance to 100 francs, Cézanne didn't know what to do and turned to Émile Zola, who by that time had already published a book and become a successful and wealthy writer. Zola started helping him, sending 60 to 100 francs every month in Hortense's name so that Cézanne's father couldn't trace the transfers through the mail. They were both already 40 years old, and Zola continued to support his friend for another 8 years, helping to cover up his lies. Besides the money, he constantly listened to Cézanne's complaints and often invited him to his estate. For Zola, this wasn't much of a problem, but such a relationship, where one depends on the other for many years, inevitably undermines the purity of friendship, which is always based on equality. The more successful one always starts to feel that he has outgrown his friend, and after 8 years, Zola would do something that Cézanne would consider a betrayal. In 1881, Cézanne, while visiting Pissarro, met the then young Gauguin, and the following year, Cézanne's father set up a studio for him in Jas de Buffon at their estate so he could see his son more often. The studio was on the second floor, and Cézanne, against all architectural rules, cut a narrow vertical window to get more light. This window, like a scar, sliced through the classical cornice between the floors, disrupting the elegant design of the street, and for this, the townspeople simply hated him. This house with the slit still exists today as a testament to the artist's stubbornness and nonconformity, but his father's offer created significant difficulties. At 43, Cézanne was still hiding from his father that he was living with a woman and had a son. And Cézanne, who now rarely returned to Paris, decided to live in two places. He settled his family in the fishing village of L'Estaque near Marseille, while he traveled back and forth to Aix to see his father, trying to create the impression that he was still a bachelor. Can you imagine how his partner felt all this time? A woman who actually preferred Paris, partying and gambling, but who had to secretly live as a mistress in a fishing village. It was the period in L'Estaque that is considered the point when his style finally took shape. During this period, as a result of endless trial and error, his signature style began to emerge. Rhythmic, often repeated brushstrokes in the same direction, which would soon come together into monochromatic blocks. It is this painting technique, at first timid and experimental, that creates a vibrating effect, as if everything is slightly doubled and trembling. And these blocks of brushstrokes would later form the basis of his famous theory and give rise to Cubism and, in fact, all modern art. Here he created the most famous views of Marseille. It was in L'Estaque that Cézanne began to move away from Impressionism. Observing the cubic shapes of the houses climbing up the slope, he developed that very method of simplifying nature into geometric figures, which would become his philosophy and most powerful legacy. By 1885, Cézanne was finally tired of living a double life. Moreover, Cézanne's father had become very old. He was already 87 years old. He could die soon, and then Cézanne's illegitimate son would be excluded from the line of inheritance. And 47-year-old Cézanne decided to make his relationship with Hortense official and finally tell his father, who didn't even suspect that he already had a 13-year-old grandson. Contrary to all gloomy expectations, his father took the news calmly and not only gave his blessing for the marriage and recognized his grandson as a legitimate heir, but also increased the artist's allowance to 300 francs. It turned out that Cézanne's suspiciousness played a cruel joke on him. All three of them had to live a double life for 17 years, and in recent years on a meager 100 francs, while the father's severity was only a product of his imagination. The following year, 1886 became a point of no return in Cézanne's life, the year he lost the two people closest to him. In March that year, Émile Zola's novel, The Masterpiece, was published in Paris. The main character is the artist Claude Lantier. He spends his whole life chasing unattainable perfection, unable to fulfill himself, теряет всех близких, и в финале, and hangs himself in front of his unfinished painting. Next to him is the successful writer Sandoz, an obvious self-portrait of Zola himself. One achieved everything, the other nothing. Zola was a determinist, meaning he believed that a person's fate is predetermined by their psychological type. And in Cézanne, who had been complaining to him about failures and misunderstandings for 30 years, he saw a typical genius whose abilities were blocked by his own fears. By that time, Zola himself was rich and famous, and had even acquired a certain arrogance. But in his book, he did not want to offend his friend. He simply saw in him such a vivid, typical archetype of the era, believing that Impressionism had lost because it failed to produce its own Michelangelo. And Zola simply couldn't resist using his friend as an example to deliver a grim verdict on all new art. He used himself and Cézanne as characters whose psychology he knew well, in order to prove that art had reached a dead end, not even suspecting that at that very moment his friend was revolutionizing art. And just 6 years later, Impressionism would take over the world, and Claude Monet would become even more famous than Michelangelo. Cézanne read the novel and saw himself. This book was a real blow to the most sensitive spot of the insecure artist. His oldest and dearest friend, practically the only person in the world he trusted, considered him a failure. Cézanne saw this as a betrayal and broke off the relationship. They would never speak again. Zola naturally wouldn't be the first to reach out from his elevated position. Both of them would, for the rest of their lives, inquire about each other through third parties, but would never again ask to meet, allowing their pride to stand between them. Zola, until the end of his life, would never understand, or perhaps never admit to himself, that Cézanne had won. Even years after their break, when Cézanne's name would start to resound, he would stubbornly refuse to admit his mistake and continue to call Paul an unrealized great force. When, in September 1902, Cézanne, who was already a well-known artist by then, was told that Zola had suffocated in his apartment because of a faulty chimney, the artist was shocked. Witnesses said that Cézanne locked himself in his studio and cried there all day. Despite 16 years of silence and resentment, he told his gardener, "I have lost a brother." He kept Zola's letters until the end of his life, as the most precious memory of his youth when they were still inseparable. And in the autumn of the same year, when Zola's book was published, Cézanne's father died. Another loss, but at the same time a great liberation. After his father's death, Cézanne inherited a huge fortune of 400,000 francs, and this changed absolutely everything, both in the artist's life and in the history of painting. And from that moment on, he became completely free. He no longer had to worry about how to support his family or how to sell his paintings. It was from this moment that the artist entered a period of maximum creative freedom, free from worries about clients and the reaction of the public and critics. Now he could fully devote himself to studying the very secret structure of the surrounding world, something that only a true artist is capable of understanding. After his father's death, Cézanne finally settled in Provence. Parisian life, cafes, exhibitions, and artist debates no longer interested him. He would go to the mountain. That very same Mont Sainte-Victoire, which he and Zola first conquered as boys. The mountain became Cézanne's second victim and model after apples. But this time it was much more monumental, completely unchanging, and infinitely patient. The mountain became his ideal model, able to remain motionless for as long as needed without complaint or groaning, while Cézanne contemplated it. It became the most important object of his quest, a tool for improvement and for searching for a special technique capable of revealing the very structure of nature. He painted it more than 80 times. There are two types of repetition in art. There is repetition as an attempt to recreate success, when an artist, having run out of inspiration, turns to a past achievement and helplessly tries to repeat it, like what happened with Malevich's black squares. And there is repetition as experimentation, when an artist searches for new forms of self-expression, like with Claude Monet's haystacks or the hundreds of portraits of Marie-Thérèse painted by Picasso. And Cézanne was one of the latter. He would come to the same place at the same time and look for a long time before touching the canvas with his brush. He got up at 4 a.m. every morning, afraid to miss the right light, and went out to paint outdoors. By 10, when the sun was high and the light changed sharply, he would stop working and go home. After noon, he would sometimes go out again to a different place with different light. When he was asked why he so often returned to the same subject, he would answer with a phrase that art historians puzzle over, "Because I still haven't understood it." And now you, I'm sure, understand why he answered that way. His late Sainte-Victoire paintings are mysterious in the history of painting. There are almost no details in them. They even look unfinished to an uninitiated viewer who doesn't know that the mountain itself is a search and experiment. And even a seemingly unfinished painting is a small but important step for the artist on the path to discovery. Rilke, the Austrian poet, after visiting Cézanne's exhibition in 1907, wrote, "His works need to be looked at for a long time. They reveal themselves slowly, like mountains." In 1889, a World's Fair was held in Paris, the very one for which the Eiffel Tower was built. All the artists in Paris fought for the right to exhibit there, but the jury categorically rejected Cézanne's candidacy. And then that longtime client of the artist, the influential Victor Choquet, intervened. He agreed to lend furniture for the exhibition, which organizers badly needed, but only if Cézanne's The House of the Hanged Man was included. The jury reluctantly gave in and the public reacted coolly. Однако это была важная стратегическая победа. Simply participating in the exhibition gave the artist a certain status, and the following year he exhibited in Brussels together with a group of new artists called the 20. Unfortunately, the artist was soon diagnosed with diabetes. There were still 30 years to go before insulin was invented. The only effective treatment for diabetes was strict starvation. No more than 400 calories a day, which allowed for an additional 12 years of life, but led to complete exhaustion of the body. Vichy Resort. Yes, this very resort gave its name to the famous Vichy Cosmetics, and it specialized in metabolic diseases. There he drank alkaline mineral water, which was believed to neutralize acidity in the bodies of diabetics. But it only brought temporary relief. He began to have vision problems, he got tired quickly, and as a result, his character, which was already not the most pleasant, became even worse, and the artist became completely unsociable. He moved away from his son and daughter-in-law, приехал к матери с сестрой и стал, and became serious and suspicious. One day, during a heavy rain, he fell on the road with his sketchbox and couldn't get up by himself. A passing cabman picked him up and took him home. The housekeeper was frightened, but the next morning this madman went out to paint again. It was during the period from 1890 to 1895 that he worked on his famous series, The Card Players. The prototype for the painting was a 17th century canvas by Louis Lenain, also called The Card Players, which hung in that very museum in Aix. And just like with Apples with a Mountain, he repeated this subject 5 times, searching for the perfect combination while looking for the right version. At first, there were 5 characters, but gradually only 2 remained. He removed all unnecessary objects and viewers, leaving only a bottle in the center as the point of symmetry and attraction. One version of the painting was sold at auction in 2011 for a staggering $250 million and is still the 3rd most expensive painting in the world, after Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, which is worth $450 million, and Willem de Kooning's Interchange, which is worth $300 million. And in 1895, an event occurred that finally brought him recognition, although Cézanne himself met it with his usual skepticism. He no longer expected anything from viewers, critics, or even friends. He was used to being misunderstood and no longer hoped to be understood. The artist simply did what he loved and created a huge number of paintings that he kept to himself. So, in 1895, the young Parisian art dealer Ambroise Vollard decided to organize a solo exhibition for Cézanne. The artist was already 56 years old. He had never had a solo exhibition before. Solo exhibitions were extremely rare in general. Usually they were organized posthumously, and it was always a big risk for the organizers. For example, the first solo exhibition of Claude Monet took place 15 years before that. На ней было выставлено всего 15 его работ. The second time, Vollard exhibited 150 works by Cézanne. Here we need to give a bit of context. Just 3 years before that, the first exhibition of Impressionists was held in the United States, which finally budged the conservative public, who had resisted the Impressionists for a whole 30 years. After returning from the United States, Paul Durand-Ruel, the Impressionist art dealer, brought the first recognition of new pictorial forms. 30 years of persistent work began to bear fruit, and the public was no longer so skeptical of the new art, which in those 30 years had already grown quite old and had given rise to a whole brood of new trends in post-impressionism. A new view of art was becoming trendy. And so the gloomy and almost unknown Cézanne found himself at the center of the forces that had been set in motion. Vollard himself told how he obtained these paintings. He went to Aix and the surrounding areas, visiting gardeners, coachmen and shopkeepers to whom Cézanne had long been giving or leaving his works. Vollard bought them for next to nothing, for 40 to 100 francs. Some paintings were found in barns. One, they say, was even used as a plug in a chicken coop. When Vollard finally reached Cézanne himself and asked him to provide works for an exhibition, Cézanne was silent for a long time, then shrugged. Take whatever you want, nobody needs them anyway. And Paris was divided. Its conservative side was still protesting, with some even standing at the exhibition entrance, trying to dissuade others from viewing this wretchedness. But fellow artists were so delighted that the exhibition became a real overwhelming success for Cézanne among professionals. Pissarro came to the exhibition and cried with joy for his friend, who was finally given his due. Monet, Degas and Renoir came as well. Young artists came several times. Matisse, who was still very young and not wealthy at the time, saw the three bathers and spent all his savings to buy this painting. He was also suffering from the same rejection of his painting. He would say, if Cézanne is right, then I am right too. And I know that Cézanne could not be wrong. Matisse would not sell this painting until his death. In 1936, he would donate it to the City Museum of Marseille with a letter. For 37 years, this painting has given me moral support in the difficult moments of my artistic quest. The paintings at the exhibition were still selling for a relatively low price of 400,000 francs, but that was already their real value. People were buying his paintings. They were paying serious money to own what he had spent his whole life on, and no longer even had the desire to show to the world. This success came as a huge surprise to him, and the auction of Victor Choquet's collection, which took place 4 years later, became a true triumph for Cézanne. This was the moment when the art market officially recognized his value. 32 works by Cézanne were presented at the auction. Prices didn't just rise, they shocked people who, just years before, saw these paintings as mere daubs. The House of the Hanged Man, the very painting from the 1889 World's Fair, was sold for 6,200 francs. It was bought by Count Isaac de Camondo. Later, it ended up in the Louvre. The Melting Shadow or similar landscapes was selling for an average of 24,000 francs. For 32 of Cézanne's works at this auction, they raised about 50,000 francs. For that amount, you could buy 23 solid houses in the provinces or one very decent house in the nearest suburb of Paris. A doctor's annual salary was 15,000 francs. This was a tremendous success. In 1900, his work was included in the exposition of the World's Fair in Paris. In 1904, there was a major retrospective at the Autumn Salon. An entire hall was dedicated to his works. And in 1906, there was another major exhibition. The critics who had laughed at him 20 years earlier were now writing about him as a living classic. In 1904, he formulated his famous thesis on the theory of art. That very knowledge of nature's structure that he had spent so long seeking in apples and in the mountain. He wrote an essay in which he argued that simple forms lie at the foundation of any complex object in nature. One should interpret nature through the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone, he wrote. The trunk of a tree is a cylinder. The head of a person or an apple is a sphere. A mountain or a bush from a distance is a cone. It is this analysis that will form the basis of Cubism. It will be taken up by Braque and Picasso, Kandinsky and Malevich. It is this that will ultimately create modern art, as we know it today. He will proclaim painting not just as a means of depicting reality, but as a way of analyzing and breaking down objects into simple parts. Cézanne's theory will become the foundation for all other painting theories. Picasso will say, Cézanne is the father of us all. Braque, Derain, Kandinsky, all of them will say that they saw Cézanne and realized that art could be done differently. That a painting is not a mirror of the real world, but an independent object with its own laws. Young artists would come to Aix on purpose to see how he worked, to hear even a single word. But what about Cézanne himself? He lived in Aix and painted studies every morning. When he heard of his success, he was more confused than pleased. Why now? He'd always painted the same way. The sudden success that befell him rather annoyed him. He couldn't understand how it was possible. After all, he hadn't changed anything. Surely not everyone on the planet could suddenly see the light? Where were they before, when they looked at those same paintings and showered them with ridicule? His suspiciousness and health problems began to convince him that this was some kind of conspiracy or mockery. He often repeated, "They want to get their hands on me." He was afraid that success would deprive him of his freedom and the ability to work alone in peace. When the prices for his paintings skyrocketed at auctions, he continued to dress like an old Provençal peasant, in a worn-out jacket and wooden clogs, in paint-stained and worn-out shoes. On October 15, 1906, Cézanne went out to paint a landscape as usual. It started to rain heavily, but he kept working in the rain for several hours and then he was found unconscious on the road. He was brought home. A week later, on October 22, 1906, he died of pneumonia. He was 67 years old. A year later, the Salon d'Automne dedicated a memorial exhibition to him, 56 paintings and 7 watercolors. George Braque came, saw it, and started doing what would later be called Cubism. That same year, Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is considered the starting point of modern art. Matisse became Matisse, and Kandinsky painted his first abstraction. The entire history of 20th century painting started from this point. All of them would later say that they did it because they saw Cézanne. That's Cézanne in a nutshell. A gloomy man who was afraid of his father, hid his wife for 17 years, didn't believe in but loved his friend, and yet, in solitude and silence in the south of France, invented what all modern art is based on. Not a school, not a manifesto, but a way of seeing and thinking, to look further, deeper, and with more structure than everyone else was used to. He wasn't sure about anything except one thing, that he had to keep going. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project where I need to build an interesting narrative, select up to 500 photos sometimes, arrange them correctly, and add captions. It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity. I'll keep doing this, but your support would be really helpful to me. Please become a sponsor of the channel here on YouTube, or even sign up for even the smallest subscription on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. We will create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. Thank you for watching.